In the summer of 2007, a photographer stood on Elliott Street in Detroit and watched a house die. It didn't burn. Nobody tore it down with a wrecking ball in one dramatic afternoon. It simply gave way, board by board, month by month, the way old things do when nobody is left to hold them up. The house was called the William Livingston House, and it had once been the private residence of one of the most powerful bankers in the city of Detroit. Preservationists had physically moved the entire structure a block to the east years earlier, trying to save it from a Red Cross demolition crew. They succeeded in saving it from that particular threat. They could not save it from what came after. The move had cracked its foundation. Water got in. Water always gets in. And so, slowly, in front of a camera that returned again and again to document the process, the mansion of a man once worth a fortune collapsed into a pile of brick and timber on a street named Elliott in a neighborhood that used to be called Little Paris. That neighborhood was Brush Park. And the story of what happened there is not really a story about a house. It is a story about what happens to a place when the people who built it get exactly what they wanted and then simply leave. Detroit today is a city people associate with abandonment, ruin photography, empty factories. But before any of that, before the auto industry even existed in the form we recognize, Detroit had a neighborhood so wealthy, so architecturally ambitious, that newspapers compared it to the boulevards of Paris. Its residents included bank presidents, lumber barons, department store founders, and the architects who would go on to reshape American cities. And then, within the span of about 70 years, nearly all of it was gone. Not sold, not relocated, gone. Torn down for parking lots, burned in fires nobody ever fully explained, subdivided into single rooms for factory workers who had no idea whose ballroom they were sleeping in. To understand how a neighborhood built for millionaires became one of the most notorious wastelands in urban America, you have to go back to a farm. Detroit in the early 1800s was still recovering from over a century of colonial handoffs. The French had founded a fur trading post here in 1701. The British took it in 1760. The Americans, on paper, got it in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, but the British didn't actually leave for another 13 years, which meant that for over a decade, nobody was entirely sure who owned what. Into that confusion stepped a Vermont-born lawyer named Elijah Brush, a Dartmouth graduate who had come west looking for opportunity on the frontier. In 1802, he married a young woman named Adelaide Askin, whose family held one of the old French ribbon farms along the Detroit River, a long, narrow strip of land running back from the water in the traditional French land division style. 4 years later, in 1806, Brush formally purchased that farm outright for $6,000. It was legally recorded as private claim number 1. He became Detroit's second mayor. He also became the territory's first attorney general. And then, in 1813, during the War of 1812, he died young, leaving behind a piece of land that nobody yet understood would become the most valuable real estate in the entire city. His son, Edmund Brush, was 11 years old when his father died. He inherited the farm, and by the 1850s, as a grown man, Edmund looked at that long strip of family land sitting just north of Detroit's crowded downtown and saw an opportunity his father never lived to see. Detroit was booming. The city was expanding in every direction, and its wealthiest citizens were tired of the noise, the smoke, and the crowding of the older neighborhoods. They wanted space, they wanted quiet, they wanted clean air and wide streets lined with trees. Somewhere close enough to downtown to be convenient, but far enough to feel like an escape. Edmund Brush decided to build them exactly that. He began laying out streets on the family farm, and, true to the era, he named nearly every one of them after his own relatives. Winder Street, honoring a family friend named Colonel John Winder, opened first in 1852. Adelaide Street, named for his mother, followed in 1853. Alfred Street came in 1869. Edmund Place, named for himself, in 1867. This was not simply subdivision, this was branding, more than a century before that word meant anything in real estate. And Edmund didn't just sell the lots and walk away. He imposed strict building requirements. Anyone who bought land in his new neighborhood had to construct a substantial home and had to do it within a specific window of time. And it had to cost thousands of dollars, a genuinely enormous sum for the era. He was, in effect, engineering exclusivity into the deed itself. You could not build cheap here. You could not build small. The neighborhood would be uniform in its excellence, or it would not exist at all. It worked. It worked almost immediately. By the 1860s and accelerating through the 1870s and 1880s, Brush Park filled with some of the most architecturally ambitious homes in the American Midwest. Architects flocked to the commissions: Julius Hess, George D. Mason, Gordon W. Lloyd, Henry T. Brush, a relative of the family itself, and a young man, barely into his 20s, named Albert Kahn, who received one of his very first major commissions designing a Brush Park mansion in 1894, before he went on to become the architect who would later define Detroit's entire industrial skyline, designing factories for Ford and Packard that changed how the world thought about manufacturing space. In Brush Park, though, Kahn was simply a promising 22-year-old given his shot at a wealthy client's front door. Between 1860 and 1900, roughly 300 homes went up across the neighborhood, and of those, about 70 were the kind of showpiece Victorian mansions that made Brush Park famous. Turrets, bay windows, ornate limestone carvings, stained glass, wraparound porches built for exactly the kind of long summer evenings that Detroit's old money wanted to spend watching their neighbors stroll by. The residents themselves read like a roll call of Gilded Age Detroit. David Whitney, Jr., a lumber baron who had made his fortune harvesting Michigan's seemingly endless forests, gave his daughter Grace a stately manor on Alfred Street as a wedding present in 1882. Grace Whitney Evans would go on to become the first president of the Detroit YWCA. Joseph L. Hudson, who had arrived in the city and opened a modest men's clothing store in 1881, built that store into the largest department store empire in the Midwest, and for a decade, from 1894 to 1904, he rented a home in Brush Park himself. William Livingstone, Jr., president of the Dime Savings Bank and a man deeply involved in improving shipping across the Great Lakes, hired the young Albert Kahn to design his residence on Elliott Street. Ransom Gillis, a wholesale dry goods merchant who co-founded a company called Edson Moore and Company, built one of the neighborhood's most recognizable homes, a Venetian Gothic mansion at the corner of Alfred and John R. that would, decades later, become one of the most famous ruins in America, and then one of its most celebrated restorations. The neighborhood wasn't only about private wealth on display. It was also about civic ambition. Temple Beth El, designed in a grand neoclassical style with a dome inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, was built to serve Detroit's prominent German Jewish community and could seat over 2,000 people. The First Presbyterian Church, modeled loosely on Boston's Trinity Church, brought a Richardsonian Romanesque presence to the neighborhood's edge, all rounded arches and heavy stone. Every child in the neighborhood, regardless of which mansion they went home to, attended the same prestigious elementary school. It was a community engineered deliberately to feel complete unto itself. A resident named Russell McLaughlin, who grew up attending that school during the neighborhood's peak years, later wrote about summer evenings on Alfred Street, describing how every front porch was occupied, how the neighbors flowed together as if one long sitting room had stretched unobstructed for a quarter mile. By the late 1880s, the nickname had stuck for good. They called it the Little Paris of the Midwest. And if you had stood on Alfred Street in 1890, watching the gas lamps come on as families gathered on their porches, you would have had no reason to believe any of it was temporary. This was old money married to new industrial wealth. This was permanence, built in limestone and oak, designed by the best architects money could hire, in a city that seemed to have no ceiling on how wealthy it might become. It lasted in its purest form for roughly 40 years. The first crack didn't come from poverty. It came from something almost nobody in Brush Park saw as a threat at first: the automobile. Detroit, of course, would go on to become synonymous with car manufacturing, but that transformation didn't happen overnight, and its earliest effects on a neighborhood like Brush Park were almost invisible at first. In the final years of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th, cars were still novelties, playthings for the wealthy, the kind of thing a Brush Park resident might own one of, parked proudly outside a mansion built for horses and carriages. But novelties have a way of becoming infrastructure, and once automobiles became genuinely practical, once streetcars extended the city's reach and paved roads made distance less punishing, something changed in how Detroit's wealthiest families thought about where they wanted to live. For decades, proximity to downtown had been the entire point of Brush Park. It lets you be close enough to your business, your bank, your church, your social obligations, while still enjoying a residential retreat. But once you could drive, that calculation collapsed. Why live on a crowded lot close to downtown when you could live on acres of land 10 or 15 minutes away by automobile, with modern electrical wiring built in from the start, with plumbing designed for the 20th century rather than retrofitted into it? Newer developments began pulling Detroit's wealthy families outward. Indian Village, Boston Edison. These neighborhoods offered something Brush Park's aging Victorian mansions increasingly could not: modernity. Many of the original Brush Park homes had been built before electricity was standard, and retrofitting decades-old wiring into a 3-story limestone mansion was expensive and often impractical. The houses that had once represented the absolute cutting edge of American domestic luxury now looked, to a new generation of Detroit's elite, like beautiful antiques, impressive to visit, exhausting to maintain, increasingly difficult to sell. By 1910, many of the original founding families, the Whitneys, the Hudsons among them, had already begun leaving, viewing their once treasured homes as expensive and outdated. And what happens to a mansion nobody wants to buy is rarely dramatic. It is, instead, a slow and practical kind of surrender. If a beautiful house cannot find a buyer who wants to live in it as a single-family home, but the location is still valuable and the building is still structurally sound, someone eventually finds a use for all that square footage. In Detroit's case, that use arrived in the form of the booming automobile industry itself, the very force that had emptied the neighborhood in the first place. Factories needed workers. Workers, many of them newly arrived immigrants and migrants from other parts of the country, needed cheap housing close to their jobs, and Brush Park, conveniently, sat close to the industrial corridors growing up around it. Grand parlors were partitioned with cheap interior walls. Ballrooms that had once hosted formal dances were subdivided into rented rooms. Servants' quarters, once used to house household staff, now held entire families. It happened fast, and it happened almost completely. By 1921, every single house along Alfred Street, the neighborhood's most prestigious block, had been converted into a boarding house or a rooming house for factory workers. Then came the crash. The stock market collapse of October 1929 devastated fortunes across the country, including many that had been built on the booming success of the automobile industry itself. Automobile production, which had exceeded 5.5 million vehicles in 1929, cratered to just 1.3 million by 1932. Smaller automakers folded entirely. Even giants like Ford and General Motors were forced into dramatic cutbacks. And in Brush Park, whatever wealthy residents had lingered into the late 1920s now found themselves facing the same economic devastation as everyone else. Any remaining original owners or their descendants who hadn't already sold or subdivided their properties did so now, often out of pure necessity. The neighborhood's transformation from private enclave to working-class housing stock, already well underway, became total and permanent. Through the 1930s, something else was happening in Brush Park, something the neighborhood's original architects and founders could never have anticipated when they were laying out streets named after their own relatives. The Great Migration was bringing large numbers of African American families north, out of the segregated South, seeking economic opportunity and escape from Jim Crow laws that had governed nearly every aspect of daily life. Detroit was one of the major destinations of that migration, and Brush Park, with its abundance of cheap subdivided housing, became one of the places where a new community took root. It grew alongside the nearby neighborhood of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, forming one of the significant African American communities in the urban north. New institutions rose out of this transition. St. Peter Claver, established in 1914 inside a former Episcopal church building, became the first Catholic parish in Detroit founded specifically to serve black congregants. Mercy General Hospital, founded in 1917 by Dr. David Northcross and Dr. Daisy Northcross, one of the first women to pass the Alabama State Medical Board, became the first hospital in Detroit founded and operated by African Americans. A black Masonic lodge took root on Watson Street. What had once been a neighborhood engineered exclusively for Gilded Age white wealth was, within a single generation, home to a resilient and self-sustaining black community, building its own institutions inside the shells of mansions that had never been designed with them in mind. This layered history matters because what came next did not discriminate between old wealth and new residents. It simply erased almost everything. World War II brought a temporary reprieve, a burst of industrial employment that kept Brush Park's rooming houses full and its residents working. But the 1950s brought a decline that would prove far harder to reverse. Broken windows, peeling paint, crumbling foundations, Detroit's property values across the aging neighborhood plummeted, and city services, stretched thin, began to deteriorate along with the buildings they were meant to support. Racial tensions boiled over into open violence in 1943, with rioting that touched the streets of Brush Park directly. A longtime resident named Russell McLaughlin, the same man who as a boy had described those idyllic summer evenings on Alfred Street, later wrote the preface to a book about the neighborhood's decline, describing Alfred Street by then as a blighted area. The elms, he wrote, had long ago been cut down. No representative of the old founding families remained. The houses stood mostly as they had half a century before, but dismal now, some with grocery stores crudely built into their front yards, some with boarded windows, all of them, he wrote, in bitter need of paint and repair. It was, in his words, a desolate street, a scene of poverty and gloom, possibly of worse things. And then came the demolitions and the freeways. City planners in the mid-20th century were not sentimental about old Victorian mansions standing in the way of modern infrastructure. The Woodward Avenue widening project of the mid-1930s had already claimed lavish homes that once lined that thoroughfare, homes demolished to make way for wider, faster roads built for a city increasingly organized around the automobile rather than the pedestrian. The Fisher Freeway construction that followed decades later shattered entire blocks of the neighborhood's southern section. An entire street, High Street, simply vanished, buried beneath concrete and asphalt. Urban planners were, quite literally, prioritizing the movement of cars over the preservation of the very neighborhood whose decline had been set in motion by those same cars decades earlier. Individual houses met individual, often mysterious fates. The George Jerome House on Alfred Street, an architecturally flamboyant, limestone-faced mansion, was demolished in 1935. The Grover Wormer residence and the Henry Kirk White House, both sitting on East High Street, were demolished in the 1960s, specifically to clear the path for the Fisher Freeway. And fire, again and again, took what demolition crews hadn't already claimed. The Woodward Avenue Baptist Church, built in 1887, burned down in 1986. St. Patrick Catholic Church, dating back to 1862, was destroyed by fire in 1993. Arsonists targeted abandoned buildings throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and neglected, decaying electrical systems caused still more fires on their own, requiring no arsonist at all. By the time the 20th century was drawing to a close, Brush Park had earned a reputation as one of the most dangerous and abandoned neighborhoods in a city that had, by then, become internationally synonymous with abandonment itself. Of the roughly 300 homes built in Brush Park across its Gilded Age peak, including the 70 grand Victorian mansions that had given the neighborhood its nickname, only about 80 original structures remained standing by the time preservationists and the city government began seriously trying to intervene. Everything else had been torn down, burned, or simply crumbled under the accumulated weight of decades of neglect. There is one house that captures the entire arc of this collapse more vividly than any other, and it belonged, fittingly, to one of the neighborhood's most powerful original residents. The William Livingstone House, designed by a young Albert Kahn in 1894 for the president of the Dime Savings Bank, was one of Kahn's earliest important commissions, built in the French Renaissance style on Elliott Street. It survived the neighborhood's decline for decades, weathered but standing. In the 1980s, the Red Cross wanted the land it occupied for a new building and intended to demolish it. Preservationists intervened, and in an extraordinary physical effort, the entire mansion was moved roughly one block to the east in 1987, saved, or so it seemed, from the wrecking ball. But moving a 19th century masonry structure is not without consequence. Foundation problems developed after the relocation, water began finding its way into cracks that hadn't existed before, and slowly, over the following 2 decades, the house that had survived a Red Cross demolition order began to collapse from the inside, under nobody's direct assault at all, simply from time and moisture and the absence of anyone with the resources to properly maintain it. Urban explorers gave it a nickname, slumpy, a grim little joke about a building visibly leaning and sagging with age. A local artist named Lowell Boileau documented its decline in a painting he called Open House, which he unveiled on the very day the mansion was finally demolished, September 15, 2007. The bank president's house, saved once by human effort and lost anyway to water and time. For most of the 20th century's final decades, that seemed to be the ending. A neighborhood of millionaires reduced to rooming houses, then to fires, then to demolitions, then to empty lots overtaken by field grass, so far gone that longtime residents later said it was hard to even imagine what the neighborhood had once looked like in its prime. But endings in cities are rarely as final as they appear. The first formal attempts to preserve what remained of Brush Park began decades before its eventual revival gained real momentum. In 1974, the smaller Woodward East Historic District, encompassing Alfred, Edmund, and Watson Streets, received Michigan State Historic Site designation and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places the following year. The city of Detroit established the larger Brush Park Historic District in 1980. These designations offered legal protections, but protection on paper does not repair a collapsing roof or replace stolen copper piping. Through the 1980s, despite these designations, Brush Park continued to slide toward what one contemporary account described as nearly total abandonment. Real, tangible change didn't begin arriving until the 1990s and 2000s, and it began small, house by house, driven initially by private individuals willing to take on enormous financial and physical risk. The Frederick Butler House was converted into luxury condominiums in 2006. The Lucian Moore House underwent a full restoration and was recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The John Harvey House reopened as a bed and breakfast. In 2005 and 2006, ahead of Detroit hosting Super Bowl 40, the city itself stepped in, stabilizing and mothballing several of the remaining historic structures, essentially placing them in a kind of architectural life support, sealed against the weather and secured against vandalism, buying time until someone could afford to do more. Then came the house that, more than any other, would come to symbolize Brush Park's improbable second act. The Ransom Gillis House, built in the 1870s at the corner of Alfred Street and John R., for the dry goods merchant who had helped shape the neighborhood in its earliest days, had become, by the 2000s, one of Detroit's most photographed ruins. Its Venetian Gothic details, sagging and stripped of most of their original ornament, had appeared as a backdrop in major films, including Beverly Hills Cop in 1984, Four Brothers in 2005, and Batman vs. Superman in 2016. A haunted-looking mansion cast again and again as a symbol of urban decay for audiences who had no idea it had once been someone's proud family home. In 2013, HGTV and the television personality Nicole Curtis, star of the show Rehab Addict, began a highly publicized restoration of the house, broadcasting the painstaking process of bringing a genuine Detroit ruin back from the brink on national television. The project drew enormous attention. When the restoration was complete, reportedly around 2,000 people showed up on a single sunny autumn afternoon simply to walk through the house that so many Detroiters had grown up assuming was permanently, irreversibly lost. The Ransom Gillis restoration didn't just save one building. It proved something to investors and developers who had for decades written Brush Park off entirely. That these houses could come back. That there was an audience, a market, a genuine appetite for saving them. What followed was not incremental. It was, eventually, the largest single residential development Detroit had attempted in decades. In 2015, Bedrock, the real estate development company founded by billionaire businessman Dan Gilbert, announced plans for a project that would eventually be called City Modern, an 8-acre development sitting directly within the historic footprint of Brush Park. Construction broke ground in 2016. It would take nearly a decade to complete. When it finally opened in full in 2025, City Modern had delivered approximately 450 new residences to a neighborhood that, only 20 years earlier, had been described as post-blight, an empty stretch of field grass and scattered stone foundations so far gone that it was difficult to picture what it had once been. The development included 286 modern rental apartments spread across newly constructed buildings, 52 new townhomes, and 53 duplex-style carriage homes built in partnership with another developer. And, in a detail that closed the loop on this entire history in a way almost too poetic to invent, Bedrock also identified 4 of the neighborhood's remaining crumbling Victorian mansions, one of which had partially collapsed, and painstakingly restored 3 of them, converting the surviving structures into 5 luxury condominium units that preserved their 19th century exteriors while rebuilding their interiors entirely for modern life. The houses that Edmund Brush's original building codes had once mandated as showpieces of Gilded Age excess were, a century and a half later, showpieces again, just for an entirely different kind of resident. The development wasn't designed purely as a market-rate luxury play either. 54 of the new apartments were set aside as affordable senior housing, specifically intended to allow longtime Detroiters, people who had lived through the neighborhood's very worst decades, to remain in the community as it transformed around them. Mona Ross Gardner, a lifelong Detroiter who had grown up in Brush Park during some of its hardest years, chaired the community advisory group that worked alongside Bedrock throughout the project's planning. She would later describe walking through the finished development and seeing, in her words, lots of life, lots of youth, lots of creativity, filling streets that she remembered as largely empty, populated mainly by drug use and dilapidated homes. The project won national recognition, too. In 2016, its master plan received the Grand Prize Award from the Congress for New Urbanism, specifically praised for its integration of walkability, historic preservation, and dense, mixed-use urban design, a formal acknowledgement that what was happening in Brush Park represented a genuinely thoughtful model for how American cities might approach neighborhoods that had been left for dead. Today, walking down Alfred Street or Edmund Place, the contrast is impossible to miss. Restored 19th century mansions with their original limestone trim and carved detailing sit directly beside sleek contemporary apartment buildings, their rooflines deliberately echoing the pitched Victorian silhouettes of the homes that once stood in their place. A pedestrian pathway called the Muse threads the entire development together, lined with small shops, a bodega, a dental clinic, a restaurant serving wood-fired, Spanish-inspired food, just steps from where department store founder Joseph Hudson once rented a home in the 1890s. The median time a home spends on the market in Brush Park today is a matter of weeks, dramatically faster than the national average, and prices for the neighborhood's new construction now regularly exceed $1 million, in a place where, not so long ago, entire mansions sat empty and unwanted, worth nothing to anyone but the scrap metal thieves who stripped their copper piping in the dead of night. So what actually happened to Detroit's millionaires, and to the neighborhood they left behind? The uncomfortable answer is that the millionaires didn't disappear in any single dramatic event. There was no crash, no scandal, no single villain who brought Brush Park down. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways more damning. The wealthy simply outgrew what they had built. The very technology, the automobile, that had made Detroit itself into an industrial superpower and the wealth engine that filled Brush Park's mansions in the first place, was the same technology that eventually made those mansions obsolete, giving their owners the literal means to drive away from the neighborhood they had spent decades constructing. What they left behind wasn't destroyed by any single force either. It was worn away gradually by decades of subdivision, by economic depression, by disinvestment, by fire, by freeways built without regard for what stood in their path, and by the simple compounding neglect that happens when a place stops mattering to the people with the money to maintain it. And yet the houses that survived because generation after generation, somebody refused to let them finish dying. Preservationists who physically relocated a bank president's mansion, even though it ultimately couldn't be saved. A television host who turned a haunted-looking ruin featured in Hollywood blockbusters back into a family home. A billionaire developer willing to gamble on 8 acres that most of the country had long since written off as unsalvageable. And residents, generations of them, who never stopped living in and around Brush Park's remaining structures, through boarding houses and riots and arson and freeway construction, who built entire communities and institutions inside the shells of a neighborhood that was never built with them in mind, and who are still there today watching the newest chapter of Little Paris unfold around them. The millionaires who built Brush Park believed they were constructing something permanent: limestone, oak, copper roofing meant to last generations, What they actually built turned out to be something more fragile, and in the end, more interesting than permanence. They built a place that could die almost completely and still, somehow, find its way back.